Feeling stifled after Carol moves into his house, Phil wishes for a do-over, and Erica and Gail come into his life. He tries to keep the two groups from meeting each other, but after his lies are exposed, he recognizes how he's hurt the people around him. After signing the divorce papers, Phil and Carol realize they might have real feelings for each other. In the cul-de-sac, Phil and Carol announce their divorce, and he wishes her the happiness he never gave her. She thanks him for the 3 weeks of marriage. Gail plays her accordion, and the divorced couple dance while the others watch awkwardly. The next day, Gail visits the newly divorced man and tells him she didn't know he and Carol were only married 3 weeks. She sets up a rendezvous for them in his bedroom at 3 p.m. At Todd and Melissa's house, Todd serves his girlfriend a heart-shaped pancake and tells her he loves her. Instead of saying "I love you back," Melissa says thank you to a stunned Todd. Later, in Carol's bedroom, where the coffee machine and the cow are, Erica asks Phil on a hike at 5 p.m. and he accepts. Hours later, Phil sees a downcast Todd on the street and asks him what's wrong. Todd tells him what Melissa answered when he confessed his feelings. He now fears that more people might show up and he'll lose her. At the edge of town, Phil uses a ladder to climb a billboard he previously painted, "Alive in Tucson" on. He crossed the words out and writes, "Move to Tampa." Suddenly, the ladder falls, and he's stuck on the billboard platform under the blistering sun. He shouts for help and cries when he realizes he might miss out on making love to 2 women. At 3 p.m., Gail arrives in Phil's bedroom, but he isn't there, so she drinks some wine on his bed. On the billboard, the helpless man uses his pants for shade, but the wind blows them away, leaving him in his underwear. At 5 p.m., Erica arrives and sees Gail on the bed, and the women ascertain that they've been double-booked and stood up. Seconds later, Carol walks in and pretends she isn't upset to see the women on Phil's bed. The following day, Todd serves Melissa a circular pancake, and she apologizes for yesterday and explains she doesn't take the word love lightly. On the billboard, Phil is severely sunburnt. While Gail and Erica are having coffee, Carol asks them how their night with Phil went, and they say he never showed up. Carol thinks the only explanation for her ex-husband passing up a chance with 2 women is because he's dead. Meanwhile, Phil wakes up on the bed of a moving pickup truck. That night, Carol tells the group they need to search for Phil since he's been missing for 24 hours. Suddenly, a pickup truck pulls up, and a tall, handsome man carries Phil in his arms. Later, the group gets to know the newcomer, Phil Miller, who says he's from North Carolina and was a contractor for Habitat for Humanity. Melissa mentions she also did volunteer work for the organization, so Todd postures and introduces himself as Melissa's boyfriend. New Phil mentions how Phil changed the sign, and the group is disappointed that he'd do that just to have all the women to himself. Minutes later, Todd expresses his worry that Melissa might leave him for the handsome man. She assures him that she likes him as long as he stays true to himself, but Todd's paranoia remains. Meanwhile, the sunburnt man visits Gail and is hopeful they might have their postponed rendezvous now, but she declines and closes the door. Through the window, he sees Gail and Erica in the living room with new Phil. The next day, Phil calls for a meeting where new Phil offers to upgrade their electricity source. Melissa replies with an innocent comment, but Todd's insecurity makes the group feel awkward and he leaves. The group then addresses how confusing it is to have 2 Phil Millers and suggests Phil use his middle name, Tandy, because new Phil doesn't have a middle name. Phil proposes a game of Jenga, the winner of which keeps the name Phil. The newcomer wins the game and the others now refer to Phil as Tandy. That evening, Tandy visits Carol and sees her fixed door. She's dressed nicely and on her way to give Phil an apple pie as a thank you gift. Tandy asks her if she likes the new guy and she asks him if he's jealous. He says he isn't, but his face says otherwise. The next day, Phil makes the cow go down the stairs, amazing the women, irritating Todd and Tandy. In the yard, where Phil built the cow a fenced-in enclosure, Tandy asks Carol how her visit with Phil went, and Carol teases that he's jealous. She says Phil plans to clean the garbage pool and he's in Erica and Gail's house now fixing their generator. At Erica and Gail's house, Phil says their generator is working fine. Then Tandy and Carol walk in. The newcomer thanks Carol for the pie and the other women say they can cook him some meals too. Carol asks Phil where he plans on living, and the women suggest their houses, but he ultimately chooses Tandy's house. Later, Todd sees the new guy driving a garbage truck and asks him if he needs any help, but Phil declines and calls him Tom as he drives away. Todd then sees Melissa happily riding on the back of the truck. Hours later, Phil shows Tandy the hot shower system he built, and Tandy is intimidated by the man's physique. At the bar, Tandy tells his ball friends that he needs to establish his dominance over Phil. Later that day, Tandy walks into the kitchen clothless, and his housemates tell him to put clothes on. Then, Erica walks in and sees an embarrassed Tandy. At Melissa's house, Todd forbids her from hanging out with Phil. He thinks she's about to break up, so he dumps her first. Melissa says she wasn't breaking up but accepts his decision, and Todd regrets what he did. At the house, Carol and Gail interrupt Erica and Phil, and the women vie for his attention. He mentions his hot shower and tells the women they can use it anytime. He notices the scarf Carol is holding and she says she made it for him. He thanks her and compliments her nail art. In the yard, Todd tells Tandy that he and Melissa broke up. Tandy says it's all Phil's fault because he wants to sleep with Melissa. That evening, Carol thanks Phil for cleaning the garbage pool, and Tandy claps sarcastically. Phil asks if he has a problem with him, and Tandy says he doesn't like how he's always trying to impress everybody. Tandy reminds everyone he's the president, and Phil runs against him, and the group has a quick vote where all the women choose the newcomer. Moments later, Phil asks them why they chose to stay in Tucson, where farming is difficult. Todd has Tandy's back and says they're all alive because of the Alive in Tucson signs. To one-up Phil, Tandy lies and says he started a secret farm. Phil wants to visit it first thing in the morning. Later, Tandy stays up all night, tilling dirt and planting seeds. A distraught Todd approaches Tandy the following day and says Phil slept with all the women last night. Immediately, Tandy barges into his house and confronts Carol and Phil. When Melissa thanks Phil for the shower, Tandy realizes the women were there to use it. On the farm, Phil commends Tandy on his work while behind them is a bag of jalapeno plant seeds. Phil apologizes for how tense things have been between them, and the two share a fist bump. In the bar, Tandy tells his ball friends that he impressed Phil and earned his respect. Meanwhile, Phil visits Carol and she welcomes him into the house. Later, Phil and Carol make love and the entire neighborhood hears them. Tandy joins Todd at the cul-de-sac, and they agree that Phil needs to disappear. The next day, while Phil sets up the solar panels, Todd tells Tandy his apprehensions about ending Phil's life. Tandy says it's easy, and all they need to do is to leave him in the desert. Todd remembers his friend leaving him in the desert and asks if Tandy planned to leave him then. The guilty man admits that he did, and Todd feels betrayed. Tandy tries to explain himself to Todd, but instead shouts how he hates Phil's guts, and the man overhears him. Later, at Carol's house, Tandy shows his ex-wife the prophylactic wrapper he found, and she admits sleeping with Phil. Tandy asks her why she and Phil didn't have to get married before sleeping together, and she says it's because she and Tandy were doing it for repopulation, while it's only casual with Phil. At his house, Tandy sees Phil packing his things. He heard Tandy say he hated him, and Tandy doesn't deny it. Phil thinks the divorced man is mad about his relationship with Carol, and Tandy scoffs. Phil says he should be angry about losing Carol because she's a special lady. At the bar, Tandy is upset that Carol is suddenly abandoning her marriage rules but mentions how radiant she's looked lately. He realizes he messed up by divorcing her and wants her back. At Carol's house, Tandy brings her flowers and jewelry, but she says he's only doing this because he can't have her anymore. He says he wrote her a song, but Phil joins Carol by the door before he can sing it. That evening, Phil surprises everyone by lighting up a lamp with the electricity from the solar panels. He and Carol kiss, and Tandy knocks over the lamp. Phil demands he pick up the lamp, but Tandy denies knocking it down and asks Todd to back him up. Still upset about that morning, Todd says he saw Tandy knock over the lamp and tells the newcomer Tandy's plan to leave him out in the desert, just like he planned to do to him before. Phil approaches Tandy menacingly and asks him to leave. Tandy runs to his house and builds a barricade on his bedroom door. 3 days later, Carol tells Phil she worries that Tandy might not be alive anymore. Her new partner thinks he'll eventually come out of the room to eat. In the bedroom, Tandy munches on a toilet paper roll. He sees a raisin ball on the floor and remembers Carol. Seconds later, Carol knocks on the door and pleads with him to come out. He thinks nobody wants him out there, but she says everyone has agreed to a truce and will welcome him back. Later, Tandy hears the group singing on the cul-de-sac and walks toward them. Suddenly, Phil tackles Tandy and Carol is shocked because she thought they called the truce. The next day, Tandy wakes up on the bed of Phil's truck. They stop in the desert where Phil leaves him with a box of supplies that'll last him 2 days. The man tells him not to return to Tucson before driving away. Tandy thinks he can survive on the food for 3 days if he rations it properly. 20 minutes later, he finishes all of the supplies. Meanwhile, Melissa visits Todd and a story she didn't know about Tandy planning to leave him in the desert. Todd tells her he loves her and she unconsciously says it back, and they kiss. In the desert, Carol arrives to drop off more supplies for Tandy. She asks him if he really wrote her a song and to sing it for her. After Tandy's sweet song, Carol asks him where they should go. Tandy is confused and she explains that she can't be with a man who leaves someone in the desert to die. She'd rather be with a man who doesn't have the heart to go through with it. In the car, they both want to start over and introduce themselves to each other. Phil mentions that he has a brother he never told her about. In outer space, a lone astronaut floats around the International Space Station. The patch on his uniform says Miller. 6 months later, in Washington, D.C., Phil, who now goes by his first name again, drives Carol to the store in a stealth bomber jet to pick up some booze. Then, Carol shoots the glass doors down with a gun to enter. Minutes later, Carol returns to the jet and asks if she can have a turn at driving, but he says it's too complicated before pushing random buttons and dropping a bomb on the street. Phil drives off, but Carol wants to turn back and get it, so he promises to return the next day to place a caution cone around it. She appreciates the gesture and they kiss. Later that day, the couple drink and soak in the margarita pool in the Oval Office of the White House. Then they drive an all-terrain vehicle inside the building and make the president's busts kiss each other. Hours later, Phil addresses his ball friends inside the press room. Meanwhile, Carol dresses up in the First Lady's clothes and poses in front of the mirror. That night, the couple makes love and Phil has adapted to Carol's talkativeness while doing the deed. Minutes later, Phil suggests they unpack their bags tomorrow and make the White House their permanent home. Carol is apprehensive because none of the luxurious houses they've lived in the past few months have felt right. He supports her continued search for the perfect place and goes to sleep. Beside him, Carol smiles as she looks at an illustration of their second wedding at Niagara Falls, and one of Phil posing in front of a geyser at Yellowstone. She flips the pages, sees her drawing of the Tucson crew, and misses all of her friends. In outer space, Mike searches for signs of life on Earth using a telescope. He crosses out the Canary Islands on a map and chats with his caterpillar friends, Terry and Nancy. The next day, Phil and Carol leave the White House. Carol wears a blindfold because Phil says their next destination is a surprise. When they arrive, Phil surprises Carol by taking her back to her old apartment in Delaware. Inside the apartment, Carol takes Phil on a tour, which ends in her bedroom covered in handmade tributes to the people she lost. That night in bed, Carol thanks her husband for taking her to Delaware, but it still doesn't feel like home for her. Exasperated, Phil asks her where she wants to go, and she says she wants to be where people are. Phil realizes she wants to return to Tucson and argues that new Phil might kill him if he goes back. Carol thinks maybe the group has forgiven him, but her husband is adamant about not returning, so she decides to sleep in a different room. On the ISS, Mike thinks about using the descent module to return to Earth but worries that even if he landed safely, he might die from the virus. He talks to his caterpillar friends but is saddened to see a lifeless Nancy. The next day, Phil and Carol give each other the silent treatment until she excuses herself to the back of the RV for a nap. Later, Phil stops at a gas station to fill up the tank. As he's manually pumping the gas, he doesn't notice his wife walking away from the RV behind him. Carol finds a shirt in the store and glues gems onto it. She yells at Phil to wait for her, but he can't hear her. Her husband drives away and Carol chases after the RV and shoots her gun to get his attention. Unfortunately, the song Phil is listening to also has gunshot sounds that sync with Carol's shots. That night, Phil sees a sign for the world's largest plate and wakes Carol up to see it, but he finds that she's no longer in the RV. He racks his brain for the Speedy Pump gas station he last stopped at, but the dozens of Speedy Pumps across the state confuse him. On the ISS, Mike places Nancy in a capsule and sends the caterpillar off into space. 2 days later, Phil finds a Speedy Pump that he's sure was the one they stopped at, but Carol is nowhere to be found. 3 days later, with still no sign of Carol, Phil finds her sketchbook and sees the Tucson crew drawing, and he believes she might be there. In Tucson, Phil musters up the courage to confront the crew. Minutes later, he wears a ghillie suit and hides in the bushes. When he sees the abandoned cul-de-sac, he comes out of hiding. His house has burned down, and inside it, he finds the framed picture of his family. He continues to wonder where Carol and the Tucson crew could be. Meanwhile, Carol sits outside an EMCO gas station, shoots her gun into the sky, and waits for her husband to return.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.